The room was quiet except for the machines. They measured everything: my pulse, my breathing, the slow, stubborn way my body refused to fail. No one from my family was there. I knew where they were. I had seen the photos before my phone went dark. Smiles, sunlight, drinks raised in celebration. My parents, my brother, a beach I had never seen. They said it was a misunderstanding, that I was overreacting, that I always made things heavier than they were. But every night, someone still came. They never spoke when I was awake, and no one ever told me who they were. I was always the one who stayed. Not because anyone asked me to. No one ever needed to ask. It was understood in the quiet way things become permanent without discussion. My brother moved through life like everything had been arranged for him in advance, doors opening, decisions made easier by voices that sounded certain. My parents followed that rhythm. They adjusted around him. They planned around him. I learned to exist in the spaces that were left. It did not feel unfair at the time. It felt normal, predictable, safe in a way that did not require attention. I woke up early, kept things in order, remembered what needed remembering. Bills, appointments, small details that never seemed urgent until they were forgotten by someone else. I handled them before they could become problems. No one praised it. That was not the point. It made the house quieter. My mother liked quiet. She said it meant everything was working. My father believed in structure, though he rarely followed through on it himself. He spoke about responsibility more than he practiced it. Still, when he did notice something done right, he would nod once, briefly, like acknowledgement was something to be rationed. I understood that language. My brother did not need to. He was louder, not in volume, but in presence. When he entered a room, conversations shifted toward him. Plans adjusted. Even disagreements softened, like no one wanted to risk disrupting whatever future they had already imagined for him. I was not part of those conversations, but I listened. It became a habit I never questioned. Sitting just outside the center of things, noticing what changed and what stayed the same. The tone of my mother's voice when she spoke to him compared to me. The way my father excused things for him that would have been unacceptable for anyone else. It did not feel like favoritism. Not clearly. It felt like gravity, like something invisible pulling everything in one direction. I adapted to it. If my brother forgot something important, I fixed it quietly. If my parents argued, I made sure the next morning felt normal again, coffee ready, small tensions smoothed over before they could be named. I was not asked to do these things. I simply saw the gaps and filled them. Over time, it became who I was, reliable, quiet, easy to overlook, and I trusted them. That was the part I never examined. Trust was not something I measured. It existed without effort, like breathing. My parents were not perfect, but they were consistent in the ways that mattered. They provided, they stayed. They made decisions I did not always understand, but I assumed there were reasons behind them. There always are, I told myself, even when I was not included. Family dinners followed a pattern. My brother spoke the most. My parents responded. I listened, added something small when necessary, then returned to silence. No one asked why I did not say more. It was easier that way, less complicated. Sometimes my mother would look at me like she was about to ask something, then change her mind. My father rarely looked up from whatever occupied him: work, his phone, the quiet calculations he carried in his head. My brother filled those empty spaces without noticing they were empty. I did not resent him. That surprised people when they tried to understand us. There was no obvious conflict, no arguments, no visible tension, just a quiet imbalance that settled deeper over time. I accepted it because it made everything stable, and stability mattered. I kept my own routines separate. Work, small responsibilities, moments of solitude that felt more honest than anything inside the house. I did not need much. I learned early how to reduce expectations until they fit the space available. It made things easier to carry. Looking back, there were signs in the way they spoke when they thought I was not paying attention. Subtle shifts, pauses that did not belong, conversations that ended when I entered the room, then resumed later in softer tones behind closed doors. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. Families have private conversations. Not everything needs to include everyone. That explanation was enough. I did not push. I did not ask questions that would disrupt the balance we had built. If something felt slightly off, I adjusted myself instead of the situation. It was a quiet form of control, keeping everything steady by reducing my own presence. No one noticed, or if they did not say anything. And I took that silence as confirmation that everything was fine, that I was where I was supposed to be, that the trust I placed in them was returned, even if it was never spoken out loud. I believed that. Completely. There was no moment where it felt fragile, no clear crack in the surface, just a steady, uninterrupted rhythm of days that followed each other without resistance. If anything was being built underneath that rhythm, I did not see it, or I chose not to. It is difficult to tell the difference when nothing has broken yet. I stayed where I was, and I trusted them to stay too. It did not change all at once. If it had, I might have noticed it sooner. A single moment, something clear enough to point to. But that is not how it happened. The shift was gradual, almost careful, like something being adjusted just enough to avoid attention. At first, it was timing. Conversations that used to happen openly began to move. Later at night, behind partially closed doors, I would walk into the kitchen and hear voices lower themselves, not abruptly, but just enough to signal that something had already been decided before I arrived. No one acknowledged it. If I asked a question, the answers came quickly, too quickly, simple explanations that did not invite follow-up. My mother was the most consistent with this. Her tone stayed calm, even warm, but there was a precision to her words that had not been there before, as if she had already practiced them. "It's nothing important. You're overthinking again. We'll tell you if it matters." She said it gently, like reassurance. I accepted it the way I always had. My father became quieter. Not distant in an obvious way, but less available. He spent more time focused on things that did not involve the rest of us. Work, mostly, or at least that is what he called it. His phone was always nearby, turned slightly away when messages appeared. He never used to do that. I noticed it once, then told myself it was nothing. People change small habits all the time. It did not mean anything by itself, but it stayed. My brother, on the other hand, became more present, but only in certain ways. He talked more about plans, trips, ideas, things he wanted to do soon. There was an energy to it that felt out of place with the rest of the house. Excitement but contained, like he was holding back details. "Something big is coming," he said once, smiling in a way that suggested he already knew the outcome. I asked what he meant. He shrugged, casual, dismissive. "You'll see." It should have sounded harmless. Instead, it stayed with me longer than it should have. Small things started slipping through. Not enough to form a clear picture, just fragments that did not fully connect. A bank envelope left unopened on the table, then gone by morning. My mother double-checking something on her phone, then locking it the moment I entered the room. Once, I heard my name. Not clearly, just enough to recognize it in the middle of a conversation that stopped the second I stepped closer. My father cleared his throat. My mother asked if I needed anything, her voice too neutral to mean anything specific. I said no and walked away. I told myself it was coincidence, that I was filling in gaps with assumptions that did not belong there. It would have been easy to ask directly, to press to stay in the room instead of leaving it, but I didn't, because pressing would have changed something. and I had spent years learning how to keep things unchanged. The discomfort stayed quiet. It did not demand attention. It sat just beneath the surface, waiting in the spaces between conversations. I adjusted around it the same way I adjusted around everything else, by reducing my presence, by not asking questions that might not have answers I wanted to hear. That was how I kept control, or at least that is what I believed. The first time it felt different was at dinner. We were all there, sitting in the same positions we always used. The routine was intact. My brother was talking about something, another plan, another vague idea about leaving soon, doing something new. My parents were listening, responding in ways that felt rehearsed. I watched them, not directly, just enough to notice the rhythm. They were aligned in a way I had not seen before, subtle but consistent, small glances between them, pauses that carried meaning I was not part of. My brother finished a sentence, and my mother nodded before he even reached the point. Like she already knew what he was going to say. I realized then that something had already been decided, not in that moment, before it. I was the only one hearing it for the first time. "Do you need anything?" my mother asked me suddenly. The question felt misplaced. I shook my head. "No," she smiled, relieved in a way that did not match the situation. My father did not look up. My brother continued talking, filling the silence that followed without noticing it had shifted. I stayed quiet. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, not thinking about anything specific, just replaying small moments that no longer fit as easily as they once did. The lowered voices, the practiced answers, the feeling of arriving late to conversations that involved me. None of it was enough to confront, but it was enough to notice. And once I noticed, it did not go away. The house was still quiet, but it was no longer the kind of quiet that meant everything was working. It felt like something was being kept in place, carefully, deliberately, without me. The first time I saw something I could not explain, it was already too late to treat it as coincidence. It was a statement, not even hidden, just placed in the wrong place at the wrong time where it did not belong. My father must have left it on the desk without thinking, or maybe he assumed I would not notice. Most people wouldn't have. I almost didn't. It was a bank statement, folded once, the edge slightly worn like it had been handled more than usual. I only looked at it because I was clearing space. That was what I did, move things back into order when they drifted out of it. I wasn't searching for anything, but my name was there. Not as the account holder, as a reference. That was enough to stop me. I unfolded it slowly, not out of caution, but because something in me resisted seeing it clearly. The numbers came first. Transfers. Large ones. Not random, not scattered, deliberate, spaced in a pattern that suggested planning. And next to them, a note. Authorization linked to primary family account. I did not recognize the account number, but I recognized the structure. It was not mine. I stood there longer than necessary, reading the same lines without fully processing them. There are moments when understanding does not arrive all at once. It comes in fragments, each one incomplete on its own. I folded the paper back exactly the way I found it, placed it where it had been, and stepped away. That should have been the moment I asked. It would have been reasonable, simple, a question with a clear answer, but I already knew the answer would not be clear. It would be explained. And explanations, I had started to realize, were becoming more controlled than the truth itself. I said nothing. Instead, I watched. Over the next few days, I paid attention in a way I had not allowed myself to before. Not openly. Not in a way anyone could detect, just small adjustments, listening a little longer, noticing what was said and what was avoided. Patterns began to form. My father made more calls than usual, always stepping outside or into another room. My mother checked accounts more frequently, her expression tightening for brief moments before smoothing out again. My brother spoke less about his plans now, but when he did, the certainty was still there, as if everything was already secured. I tried to connect it to the statement. There was no direct link I could prove, only alignment. Then there was the message. It appeared on the family tablet, the one we all used occasionally, left on the kitchen counter. Notifications usually meant nothing, reminders, updates, things that did not require attention. But this one stayed longer than it should have. A preview, just a single line. Transfer confirmed. Final amount received. No name attached. No context. Just confirmation. I looked at it for a moment, then turned the screen off. When my mother came into the kitchen minutes later, she picked up the tablet immediately, too quickly for it to be casual. Her eyes moved across the screen, scanning, checking, then she locked it. "Did you need something?" she asked. The same question again. "No," I said. She nodded, but there was a delay before she turned away. A calculation. A brief uncertainty about what I might have seen. I gave her nothing to respond to. That night, my brother mentioned something new. "Flights are getting expensive," he said, almost to himself. My father responded without looking up. "It's handled." Handled. The word settled in the room, heavier than it should have been. I didn't ask where the flights were going. I didn't ask when. The answers were already forming around me, just out of reach, like a conversation happening in another room with the door slightly open. Enough to hear the tone, not enough to understand the words. The next day, I checked something I had not thought about in a long time. My own account, not out of suspicion, just a need to confirm something simple, something stable, a way to anchor myself back into certainty. The balance was lower than I expected, not dramatically, just enough to notice. At first, I assumed I had misremembered, that I had overlooked a payment, a bill, something routine that explained the difference. But the transactions did not match anything I recognized. Small amounts spaced out, and one larger withdrawal, authorized. The word appeared again, authorized. I stared at it longer than I should have. There was no alert, no notification, no direct indication that something had gone wrong. Only the record, clean, documented, final. I closed the app without making any changes. There were ways to investigate it immediately. Calls I could make, questions that could force clarity, but I didn't, because clarity would require confrontation. And confrontation would break something that had not fully revealed itself yet. I was not ready for that, not without understanding what I was stepping into. So I did what I had always done. I stayed quiet, I observed. And for the first time, I stopped assuming that what I was seeing had a harmless explanation. Something was wrong, not vaguely, not emotionally, structurally. And whatever it was, it had already been put into motion. Without me, I did not confront them immediately. Not because I was unsure anymore, but because I understood something had already shifted beyond a simple explanation. Whatever was happening had been arranged carefully, and I was only beginning to see the edges of it. So I waited, not passively, just long enough to choose the moment. It came in the afternoon, when the house was quiet in the way it used to be. My mother was in the kitchen, going through something on her phone. My father was home earlier than usual, sitting in the living room, reading without really turning the pages. My brother wasn't there. That made it easier. "I noticed something," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I kept it simple, the way I always had. Both of them reacted in small ways, not dramatic. My mother's hand paused for a fraction of a second before she set her phone down. My father's eyes lifted just enough to acknowledge I had spoken. "What do you mean?" my mother asked. Her tone was calm, too calm. "There are transactions," I said, "from my account." I watched their faces as I said it. My father leaned back slightly, like the question required distance. My mother's expression didn't change, but something behind it tightened. "You probably forgot," she said. The answer came too quickly. I checked, I said. I didn't authorize them. That was the first moment the air changed. Not visibly, nothing dramatic shifted. But something in the space between us closed slightly, like a door that had been open just enough was now being pushed toward shut. You've been stressed, my father said. He spoke slowly, measured. You've had a lot on your mind lately. I let the words sit. They weren't addressing the question. They're marked as authorized, I said. My mother exhaled softly, almost like she was tired of the conversation before it had even begun. Then they are, she replied. That's how the system works. The system. I noticed the word. I nodded once, not agreeing, just acknowledging that she had said it. And the transfers, I asked. The larger ones. My father's gaze shifted slightly, not away but not directly at me either. Family accounts move money around, he said. It's not unusual. It is when I don't know about it. There was a pause, not long, just enough to make the silence noticeable. My mother stepped in before it could stretch further. You're making this into something bigger than it is, she said. We handle things as a family. That includes finances. Her voice stayed even, controlled. I could feel the shape of the conversation forming now, not toward clarity but away from it. Each response redirected, softened, minimized. You used my account, I said, not a question, a statement. My father leaned forward slightly this time, resting his hands together. No one is using anything, he said. You're part of this family. That means things are shared. Shared. The word didn't match the reality I had seen. Without telling me, my mother's expression shifted then just slightly, not to anger, to something closer to disappointment. Why are you reacting like this? She asked. We've always handled things this way. That wasn't true, but it was close enough to something familiar that it almost sounded reasonable. You didn't ask, I said. We didn't think we needed to, she replied. There it was, not denial, just justification. I felt something settle inside me then, not anger, not even frustration, just a quiet recognition that the conversation was not meant to resolve anything. It was meant to redefine it. You're overthinking, my father added. It's a small amount. It doesn't affect you. I thought about the statement, the transfers, the pattern. It does, I said. My brother walked in then, the timing precise enough to feel intentional, even if it was. What's going on? He asked. No problem, my mother said quickly. Just a misunderstanding. He looked at me, waiting. I held his gaze for a moment. They used my account, I said. He blinked once, then shrugged. Okay, he said. It's not a big deal. The response was immediate, effortless, aligned. You knew, I asked. He didn't hesitate. Of course, he said. It's for something important. What? He smiled slightly, the same controlled excitement from before. You'll see. The same answer, the same deflection. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to ask that would produce a different answer. My mother stepped closer, her voice softening. You need to trust us, she said. We're not doing anything against you. Against you. The phrasing mattered. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I understood something clearly now. They weren't denying what they had done. They were reframing it until it no longer sounded like a violation. And more importantly, they expected me to accept that version. Okay, I said. It was the only word that didn't escalate anything. My father relaxed slightly. My mother smiled, relieved. My brother lost interest almost immediately, moving on to something else. The conversation ended without resolution, but something had been decided, not by them, by me. I would not ask again, not because I believed them, but because I had finally understood that asking would never lead to the truth. Only to a version of it that kept everything exactly where they wanted it, and where I was expected to remain quiet, compliant, and uninformed. I stayed there a moment longer, then stepped away. No one stopped me. No one followed. And for the first time, the silence in the house didn't feel stable. It felt controlled, deliberate. and I was no longer inside it the way I used to be. The hospital did not feel real at first, not in the way the house had. Not in the way routines used to anchor everything into something predictable. The hospital was structured, efficient, precise, but detached. It functioned without needing me to understand it. Machines replaced conversations. Records replaced explanations. And for the first time, I found myself surrounded by a system that did not adjust its truth to protect anyone. I had been admitted quickly, too quickly to process the sequence of events that led there. A sudden collapse, they said. Severe enough to require monitoring. Not immediately life-threatening, but close enough that no one used casual language around it. I remembered fragments, the floor, a voice calling my name, then nothing until the ceiling above the hospital bed became the only fixed point I could rely on. My phone was taken early. "Just for now," a nurse told me. "You need to rest." I didn't argue. Rest was easier than thinking. The first day passed in quiet observation. Nurses came and went, their movements efficient, their tone neutral but not unkind. They checked numbers, adjusted settings, documented everything with a level of detail that felt almost excessive. But nothing was left unrecorded. That mattered. My parents visited once. Briefly. My mother stood closer to the bed, her expression composed in a way that suggested control more than concern. She asked how I felt, but not in a way that required an answer beyond something simple. "I'm okay," I said. She nodded, relieved by the answer she expected. My father stayed near the door. He asked the doctor a few questions, technical, detached, then seemed satisfied with the responses. His focus was on outcomes, not presence. "We'll handle things at home," he said before leaving. Handle. The word returned. My brother didn't come. No explanation was offered. I didn't ask. After they left, the room felt quieter than before, but not empty. The machines continued their steady rhythm. The staff continued their routine. The system remained consistent, unaffected by who chose to be there and who didn't. That consistency became something I started to rely on. On the second day, I asked for access to my records. Not my medical records, my account. The request was simple. A nurse provided a tablet explaining how to log in. There were no questions about why I needed it, no hesitation. It was not their role to interpret, only to provide. The balance had changed again. More than before. The transactions were no longer spaced out. They had accelerated. Larger amounts moved more quickly. The same authorization label appeared next to each one, clean and final. No alerts, no confirmation requests, just execution. I scrolled through them slowly, not rushing, letting each entry settle before moving to the next. The pattern was no longer subtle. It was structured, deliberate, and ongoing. There was a message attached to one of the most recent transfers. Not from my bank, from an internal note. Final installment processed, remaining allocation complete. Allocation. The word didn't belong to me. It belonged to planning, to distribution, to decisions made in advance. I closed the account, not because I had seen enough, but because I understood what I was looking at now. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't temporary. It was something that had been designed to continue whether I was aware of it or not. Later that evening, a nurse paused longer than usual while checking my chart. She hesitated, not visibly enough to draw attention, but enough that I noticed. "Is everything okay?" I asked. She looked at me, then at the chart, then back at me. "You've had visitors," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded once. "My parents." She paused again. "And someone else," she added. I didn't respond immediately. "What do you mean?" Her tone remained neutral, but there was something careful in the way she chose her words. "Late at night," she said. "They come after visiting hours. It's been approved." "Approved? By who? I didn't ask." "Who is it?" I said. She shook her head slightly. "I don't have a name on file," she replied. They don't stay long. That didn't make sense. Hospitals recorded everything, everyone. You're sure? I asked. She nodded. They check in, she said. But it's different. Different. The word lingered longer than it should have. I let it go. Not because it wasn't important, but because it didn't connect yet. It was another fragment, another piece that existed without a clear place. That night I stayed awake longer. Not intentionally, just waiting. The room was dim, the machines steady, the hallway outside quiet except for distant movement. Time felt slower, stretched between moments that did not change. And then the door opened. Softly. Not enough to wake someone who was asleep, but I was. I didn't turn immediately. I listened. Footsteps, controlled, familiar in their restraint but not identifiable. Someone moved closer to the bed. I kept my eyes closed, not out of fear, out of choice. There are moments when seeing something too early changes what it becomes. I wasn't ready for that. The presence stayed for a few seconds, maybe longer. It was difficult to measure. There was no sound beyond breathing that wasn't mine. Then a shift. Something placed on the table beside me, light, careful, and then the footsteps again moving away. The door closed the same way it opened. Quiet, deliberate. I opened my eyes. The room was the same, except for one thing, a folder, plain, unmarked. Left where there had been nothing before. I didn't reach for it immediately. I just looked at it. Because whatever was inside was not meant to be explained, only discovered. I did not open the folder right away. Not because I was afraid of what it contained, but because I understood something had shifted again. The pattern I had been observing, fragments, inconsistencies, controlled explanations, had changed direction. This was no longer something I had to search for. It had been placed in front of me, deliberately. I sat there for a while, watching it the same way I had watched everything else over the past few days, without reacting, without reaching too quickly toward a conclusion that might still be incomplete. The hospital room remained unchanged. The machines continued their steady work. The hallway outside moved at its usual pace, detached from whatever was happening inside this space. Everything was functioning as it should, except this. I reached for the folder slowly, more out of recognition than urgency. It was light, thinner than I expected. No markings on the outside, no indication of who had left it or why. Inside there were documents, copies, printed, organized, dated. The first page was a summary. Not of my medical condition, of financial activity. I recognized the structure immediately. Not from personal experience, but from the clarity of it. This was not something casually assembled. It was formatted the way internal audits are: clean, chronological, precise. Each transaction listed, each transfer traced, each account connected. And at the center of it mine, not as the origin, as the source. I read through it once without stopping, then again, slower. The pattern was no longer abstract. It was mapped out in a way that removed interpretation. Funds had been moved from my account into a consolidated family account. From there, redistributed, large amounts, purpose labeled in a way that felt administrative. Travel allocation, accommodation advance, discretionary expense. The words were neutral, but the totals were not. At the bottom of one page, there was a confirmation. Package secured, Cancun. I stopped there, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. Completely, the flights, the transfers, the timing, everything my brother had hinted at without saying. Everything my parents had reframed instead of explaining. It had already happened, or was about to, and I had paid for it. I set the folder down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table as if precision could contain what it represented. There was no anger. Not yet, only clarity. A nurse entered shortly after, checking the monitors with the same routine efficiency as before. She glanced at the folder briefly, then at me. "You found it," she said. It wasn't a question. "You know what it is?" I asked. She nodded once. It was left with your chart, she said. It's part of a documentation request. From who? She hesitated. Internal, she replied. I don't have more than that. Internal, another system, another layer. I didn't press further. Instead, I asked something else. My family, I said. Have they been here? She looked at the chart again. They checked in yesterday, she said, but they didn't stay long. Yesterday, that aligned. And today, she shook her head. No visits logged. I nodded once. Thank you. She left without adding anything else. The room returned to its controlled silence. I picked up the folder again, turning to the last section. There were timestamps, not just of transactions, but of access, who had authorized them. When? From where? My father's name appeared multiple times. My mother S. less frequently, but still present. And my brother not as an authorizer, as a beneficiary. The structure was complete. No gaps, no ambiguity. It wasn't just that they had used my account. It was that they had built a system around it, one that continued to function whether I questioned it or not. I closed the folder. There was nothing left to confirm, only something left to decide. My phone was returned later that afternoon. No explanation. Just placed beside me as if access had always been temporary. I turned it on. Messages loaded slowly, one after another, filling the screen with conversations I had not been part of. Family group chat, photos, bright, clear, immediate. My brother standing on a beach, sunlight reflecting off the water behind him. My parents beside him, smiling in a way that looked effortless. Cancun. The location tagged, time stamped. Current, they were already there. I scrolled through the images without stopping, not pausing on any single one long enough to react. There were captions, small comments, details about the trip. None of them mentioned me, not directly, only one message from my mother. We'll explain everything when you're back. Back, as if I had left, as if this had been a shared decision. I locked the phone, set it down, and let the silence settle again. The folder remained on the table, unchanged. The system it represented was still active. But something else had entered it now. Documentation. Records that existed outside of their control. Whoever had left that folder was not part of my family, and they were not ignoring what had happened. That mattered more than anything my parents could say. That night I stayed awake again, not waiting this time, just aware. The door opened at nearly the same hour as before. The same controlled movement, the same quiet presence. I didn't move, didn't turn. But this time, I listened more carefully. There was a pause near the table, the sound of paper being adjusted. Then something else, a breath, closer than before, not hurried, not uncertain, intentional. I opened my eyes slowly, not fully, just enough to see a shape beside the bed, still, watching. Not in a way that felt threatening, but not familiar either. Before I could focus, the figure stepped back. The movement was precise, practiced. The door closed behind them, and the room returned to what it had been, except for one detail. The folder was no longer where I had left it. It had been repositioned, open to a different page. A single line marked, highlighted. I sat up slowly, ignoring the pull of the monitors, and looked at it. The line was simple, clear, undeniable. Next transfer scheduled. The date was tomorrow. And this time I would be awake. I did not stop the transfer. That was the first decision I made when I saw the date, not because I couldn't. By then, I understood enough to intervene. I had access again. I had the records, the timestamps, the structure of how everything moved. It would not have been difficult to interrupt it, to call the bank, to flag the activity, to force everything into review. The system allowed for that, but I didn't, because stopping it would have warned them, and warning them would have changed how they behaved. I needed them to continue exactly as they had been, unaware, certain. I closed the folder and left it where it was. This time, I did not adjust it back to its original position. I let it remain open, the marked line visible, as if acknowledging that whatever process had started was now shared between me and whoever had placed it there. There was no reason to hide that anymore. The day moved slowly, not because anything changed, but because I stopped trying to move with it. I stayed still, observing the same routines that had once felt distant but now felt precise. Nurses entered, documented, left. Machines recorded without pause. The hospital continued its work without emotion, without interpretation. It didn't care what the numbers meant, only that they were accurate. I found something steady in that. Around midday, I opened my account again. The scheduled transfer was still pending. Time stamped, authorized. Everything aligned exactly as it had before. No hesitation in the system. No indication that anything was wrong. I checked the access logs again, my father's credentials. My mother's confirmation, the same structure, the same pattern. Nothing had changed on their end. They were still operating under the assumption that I would not intervene, that I would not even see it. I thought about calling them, not to confront, just to listen. To hear how they would explain something that had already been fully documented. But I didn't, because I already knew what they would say. It would be the same language, the same reframing. Words designed to soften, redirect, minimize. Nothing that acknowledged the structure of what they had built. Nothing that would match the records. So I stayed silent, not out of fear, out of clarity. Silence was no longer submission. It was control. The transfer completed in the evening. No notification beyond the standard confirmation. No alert. No interruption. Just execution. I watched it happen in real time, the way I might have watched any other routine process before all of this began. Except now, I understood what it represented. Finalization, not just of a payment, of a pattern. They had taken everything they intended to take. There would be no more after this. That realization didn't feel like relief. It felt like a boundary, clear, defined, and irreversible. I set the phone aside and looked at the folder again. The marked line was now part of a completed sequence. Nothing left pending. No future dates. No upcoming transfers. The system had reached its end, but something else had just begun. Later that night, the room felt different. Not because anything in it had changed, but because I had. The waiting was gone. The uncertainty had been replaced by something quieter, more stable. Acceptance. Not of what they had done, but of what it meant. They had not made a mistake. They had not acted out of urgency or confusion. They had planned it, executed it, and continued it without hesitation, even when I was no longer present to question it. That was the truth. And it did not require confrontation to exist. The door opened again. The same hour, the same controlled movement. This time I turned my head slightly before they reached the bed, not enough to fully see them, just enough to acknowledge that I was aware. The footsteps paused. There was no immediate retreat, no attempt to leave. They stayed. I could feel it. A presence that did not belong to the family I had known, but also did not feel separate from what had happened. Connected. In a way I did not yet understand. "You're awake," a voice said. Quiet, measured, not surprised. I didn't respond immediately. I studied the tone. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't apologetic. It was observational. "Yes," I said. The word felt heavier than it should have. A pause followed. Then, "You didn't stop it." Not a question, a statement. "No," I said. Another pause, longer this time. "Good," the voice replied. There was no explanation attached to it, no justification. Just acknowledgement. I turned slightly more, enough to see the outline of the person now, still indistinct in the dim light. Features not fully visible, but present. Real. "Who are you?" I asked. The question felt necessary, even if I wasn't sure I would get an answer. The figure didn't move closer, didn't step back. They remained exactly where they were. "Someone who documents," they said. The answer didn't clarify anything. But it wasn't meant to. I let it settle. "You left the folder," I said. "Yes." "Why?" Another pause, not hesitation, consideration. Because you were the only one who didn't have access to what was already yours, they said. The phrasing was precise, carefully constructed. It matched the structure of everything I had seen in the documents. You could have reported it, I said. The words came out without intention, just observation. We are, they replied, not future tense. Present, ongoing. I didn't ask who we was. It didn't matter yet. What happens now? I asked. This time the answer came without pause. Nothing immediate, they said. That's the point. I understood that. Consequences, when they came through systems, didn't arrive with noise. They arrived with timing, precision, and permanence. The figure stepped back then, the movement controlled, the same as every other night. Before leaving, they adjusted the folder one last time, closed it, aligned it perfectly with the edge of the table. Then they left. The door closed. And the room returned to silence. But it was no longer the same silence I had known before. This one didn't belong to my family. It didn't depend on what they said or didn't say. It belonged to something else, something already in motion. And for the first time, I wasn't outside of it anymore. Nothing happened the next day. That was the first thing I noticed. No calls, no messages beyond what had already been sent. No sudden urgency from my parents, no attempt to explain, correct, or even acknowledge what had been completed. The system on their side had reached its conclusion, and because of that, they had relaxed. I could see it in the photos. I opened my phone once in the morning, not out of habit, but to confirm something I already understood. The group chat had updated again overnight. More images, different angles of the same place. My brother at a restaurant, my parents near the water. Unchanged expressions, no tension, no indication that anything had shifted. They believed everything was finished. That belief mattered because it meant they weren't preparing for anything else. They weren't watching for consequences. They weren't expecting them. I closed the chat and set the phone aside. The hospital continued its routine. Discharge was mentioned briefly, soon, but not immediate. There were still things to monitor, still records to finalize. Everything moved through process. Nothing rushed. By the afternoon, the first change appeared. Not in my account. In theirs, I accessed what I could carefully, using the same pathways I had observed before. The shared structures they assumed I didn't understand. The permissions that had been extended without considering that I might one day use them differently. The primary family account was restricted, not frozen completely, limited, transactions pending review. There was a notice attached. Verification required, irregular activity detected. The language was neutral, but the implication was not. I didn't react. I just read it again, confirming the phrasing, the timing. It aligned with the completion of the final transfer. Exactly. Later, another update. A secondary account my brothers flagged, not for the same reason, different wording. Source of funds under review. More precise, more direct, the structure was unfolding. Quietly, systematically. No alerts sent to me, no explanations offered, but everything documented. I didn't need to guess what would happen next. These processes didn't stop once they started. They expanded, layer by layer, until everything connected to the original activity was examined. That evening, my phone rang, my father. The first call since I had been admitted. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. Hello. His voice was controlled, but not as steady as before. There's an issue with the accounts, he said. Not a question, not a greeting. A statement framed as if I already knew. I see that, I replied. A pause, short. You've been accessing them, he asked. Yes. Another pause, longer this time. You should have told us, he said. The phrasing was familiar, shifting responsibility, reframing access as a violation. I wasn't aware I needed permission to view my own account, I said. He didn't respond immediately. They've restricted everything, he said instead. We can't move funds. I know. My tone didn't change. There was movement on his end. A shift like he was adjusting his position, recalculating something he hadn't expected to confront directly. "This is temporary," he said. "We'll resolve it." Resolve, another familiar word. "How?" I asked. The question was simple, direct. It left no room for abstraction. "We'll speak to them," he said. "Explain." Explain. I thought about the folder, the documentation, the timestamps, the pattern. "They already have the records," I said. Silence. Not empty, heavy. "You don't understand how these things work," he said finally. I didn't respond, because I did, more than he realized. "They're asking questions," he continued, "about the transfers, the amounts." "They should," I said, another silence, this one sharper. "You're part of this," he said. The words landed differently now, not as inclusion, as implication. "I know," I replied, and I let that be the end of it. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't try to push further. Because for the first time, there was nothing he could say that would change what had already been recorded. The call ended without resolution. That night, the system continued its work. Another notification, formal this time, an inquiry initiated, documentation requested, deadlines assigned, everything structured, everything traceable. No emotion, no interpretation, just process. I didn't need to be present for any of it. I didn't need to explain. The records would do that. Better than I ever could. The door opened again as it had every night, the same presence, the same controlled movement. I didn't turn this time, I didn't need to. "They've started," I said. "Yes," the voice replied, no satisfaction, no approval, just confirmation. "It will take time," they added. "I know." A pause, then "You stayed quiet," not a question. "Until it mattered," I said. The response came without hesitation. "That's why it holds." I understood what they meant, not emotionally. Structurally, reactions create noise. Noise creates gaps. I had given them none. The figure remained for a moment longer, then stepped back. The same routine, the same silence after, but this time it didn't feel like waiting. It felt like completion, not of the situation, but of my part in it. Everything else was already in motion, and it no longer required me to carry it. I was discharged 3 days later. No one from my family came. The nurse handled the paperwork with the same steady efficiency I had come to recognize. Signatures, confirmations, instructions, everything documented, everything complete before I was allowed to leave. The system closed its part cleanly. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter, just unfamiliar in a way that comes after something has shifted permanently. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, adjusting to the absence of machines, of controlled silence, of routines that did not depend on me. My phone remained quiet. No messages, no calls. The group chat had stopped updating, not gradually, all at once. I didn't need to check why. Processes reach a point where continuation is no longer possible. Accounts remain restricted. Inquiries expand. Explanations fail when they meet records that do not change. I knew where my parents were. Not physically, structurally. Inside something they could not redirect. My brother, too, not separate from it, connected by the same pattern that had once protected him. I didn't follow it further. There was nothing left for me to confirm. Everything that needed to exist already did. That night I sat in a space that was finally mine. No shared accounts. No overlapping systems, no quiet expectations I had to maintain, just absence, clear, undeniable. I thought about the hospital, the room, the folder, the presence that had come every night without asking for recognition. They never returned after I left. They didn't need to. Their role had never been to stay, only to ensure that what was already there was seen. I never learned their name. I didn't try to. Some things are not meant to become personal. They exist to complete something, not to belong to it. In the end, nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation. No final conversation. No moment where everything was said out loud and understood, just distance, created not by emotion but by record, by systems that do not forget, by decisions that cannot be undone once they are documented. I didn't feel resolved. I didn't feel vindicated, just aware of what had been taken, of what had been revealed, and of what remained after everything else had been processed, quiet, still, and finally mine.